Oh, hell Internet! This is the summary video to The Conquest of Space and the Stature of Man by Hannah Arendt. This is a short essay, so I will make it a short video, but if you want the more expanded look at this essay, then the full video can be found here. To start with, a better title for the essay might be The Effect of Scientific Advancement on the Stature of Humanity, of which The Conquest of Space is just the clearest example. The primary question of the essay is, has man's conquest of space raised or lowered his stature? And it leads Arendt to the secondary consideration of how we are able to practically judge this stature and any change to it. Of course, Arendt begins from antiquity as usual, and she concludes that it was the Romans who, in their concept of humanitas, gave birth to the fundamental idea of human dignity, and it was this that enabled the concept of the stature of man to exist at all. I further implied the idea that this might be one of the roots of Western individualism. Arendt suggests that the primary question above is one of common sense. Thus, it belongs within the scope of what all humans can perceive and thus agree to, or at least agree to a certain extent. As we saw in The Crisis in Culture, Arendtian common sense is more nuanced than the everyday meaning of that term, but it amounts to something similar. What it does mean, however, is that the primary question cannot be answered at all in any way that does not rely on the sense perception of humans. This enables variable definitions of common sense based on opinions, and this is a fact which makes it unlikely to convince any scientists, as scientists must be compelled by the data, but data presents a problem of its own. The data which underpins modern science are often shown to us only via the outputs of machines and equations which measure the events or collocations of events which take place in the real world. It is these measurements and not the events themselves that we use to draw our conclusions. As much as these data are often highly reliable and repeatable, they are nonetheless not within the purview of common sense, and thus, according to Arendt's criteria, they are not suitable for judging the stature of man. However, the very repeatability of the process compels the scientist in their own sphere to consider these truths to be indications of a realm which is more real than the sensory realm in which we all live, including the scientists themselves. And furthermore, all humans can clearly see that the truths of science do have tangible effects on the world in which we live, and this means that there must be at least some common sense validity in the scientific project. So what are we to make of this briar patch overall? Well, on the one hand, the scientist can demand of the humanist that their work be taken seriously. But on the other hand, the humanist can force the scientist to admit that in terms of common sense, they, the scientists, have no intuitive understanding of the changes they are bringing into the human world. This fact was recognized explicitly by many of the great scientific luminaries of the 20th century, Bohr, Planck, Einstein, Schrödinger, and, most crucially for Arendt, Heisenberg, in his discovery of the uncertainty principle. And it's here we'll begin our discussion of how we perceive the stature of humanity changing. But first we must begin to clarify what we think the stature of humanity actually is. Arendt clarifies her definition of the stature of man through a line later on in the essay. Mankind, she says, seeks to have a larger territory, referring to the general expansionist tendencies of our race. This links the stature of man to our command of territory, for only an entity with a larger stature is able to stand, like Colossus, so to speak, in command of a larger territory. This territory is not restricted to geographic territory. It can easily relate to ideological, economic, or even emotional territory in a more metaphorical sense. So this is our first pass at defining the stature of humanity. To command territory implies the existence of a commander, and it is this sense of agency which indicates how humanity is able to perceive its own stature, and any change to that stature. But how might that stature actually change? In the modern era, it is all related to the progress of science. Science began with radically new thoughts and conceptual frameworks. Initially, these new ideas were clear-ish to everyone, and so they met the requirement of common sense. But now it is impossible that any layman can claim a common sense understanding of the state of scientific progress. Heck, most scientists can't even claim that. Arendt is clear that scientists do not actively try to affect or control the stature of man, but neither will they make any effort to defend it. Science has its own agenda, and it will continue to pursue that regardless of the stature of man. Furthermore, it will always be supported by those who do see political power to be gained by the project of science, namely the politicians and the businessmen. Those who do perceive and care about the stature of humanity then, the laity and the philosophers, and I suppose some of the clergy, they have no recourse to undermine the project of science itself. Scientists are compelled to pursue this project of finding the underlying patterns and harmonies of the universe, and this is generally, although obviously not always, to the benefit of humanity at large. And the politicians and the businessmen are compelled to pursue the power that science is able to impart, and this is often on much more morally grey territory. What might undermine the project of science, though, is the idea that it could be self-defeating in its own terms, and this is where Arendt turns to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Some quantities in physics, and therefore by hypothesis larger systems too, are measurable with precision only because the measurement of some other quality loses precision, and this literally affects the questions which we can meaningfully ask in any given context. Arendt supports this Heisenbergian conclusion by asking two rhetorical questions with contradictory implied answers. Question 1 is, how can anyone doubt that a science which has enabled man to conquer space and go to the moon has increased his stature? The second question is, has not each of the advances of science since the time of Copernicus almost automatically decreased his stature? The two conclusions drawn from these questions are both based on the progress of science, and yet they each draw opposing conclusions about the stature of humanity. They are each based on individually consistent worldviews, and it is here that the nature of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle imposes on the humanistic stature of man, and the scientist is powerless to provide an answer in their own terms. Arendt looks at a quote of Kafka's to elucidate this. Man found the Archimedean point, but he used it against himself. This is in reference to the two opposing answers to our rhetorical questions. As one sense of the world increases the stature of man, another sense of the world reduces it. And one result of this conflict is how Arendt concludes the essay. If science is able to completely explain all aspects of the world, then the stature of humanity would not simply have been reduced, but have been destroyed. And so we see that science has a paradoxical relationship with the stature of man. But if science does continue down the path it is on, then it will continue to be difficult for common sense to reconcile the diversion between these two interpretations of the stature of humanity. At the end of the essay then, we do not really have an answer to the binary question with which Arendt started, but I think this is because Arendt has only obliquely answered what the stature of man consists in. The command of territory definition does beg the Euphythro adjacent question, what exactly was it that allowed the territory to fall under our command in the first place? I think Arendt's goal here, though, is just to identify a problem. She does not have the solution. This is another crisis of modernity. We have spent all of history trying to identify things and to classify them and thus control them to some extent. But now the process of this discovery has started to impose, or perhaps impose again, on some of the previous classifications that have been pivotal to something that we consider intrinsically important about the nature of our personal place in the human endeavour. In short, our stature. The stature of any object or creature is a form of comparison of itself to that which exists around it. Comparing things in any dimension needs a place from which to view them, an Archimedean point, if you will. This contrast demonstrates another way of looking at the stature of humanity. It is the self-esteem of humanity, our measure of what we should even consider it valid for a member of our species to do, or try to do. And this is why it must remain something that all humans have access to. It does beg the question, however, of what we are comparing ourselves to. As a final aside from me, Arendt never makes this explicit herself, but I think that this essay has something to say on the relationship between science and religion. On the one hand, science and religion do seem to have very different methods and ways of looking at the world, and it's essentially the former's focus on data which discerns this difference. But on the other hand, the very fact that both can impose so heavily on the stature of humanity suggests that there is another space, somewhere out there, in which they both occupy the same region, so to speak. There is, hypothetically, somewhere, a most harmonious form of this relationship, and I venture that this is not the form that we see in the world today. Although, again, on the other hand, do we really want this form to be the one that we see? Most harmonious is a very pleasant descriptor, but is it necessarily an optimal one? Okay.